So, in fact, I'll talk to you a little bit today about something that I believe, but as of yet I can't prove. The neurobiologist Dean Buoyancy, in referring to the concept of recognition of patterns, has suggested that understanding a whole is improved by understanding the relationship between the parts. And I would like to use that idea in drowning prevention and suggest that the whole that we're talking about in the first part of this short presentation is the drowning episode itself. The parts might be those competencies that are missing, which trigger the episode, and then the relationships between those missing competencies is really the heart of what I would like to discuss with you. And of course, if we know more about what actually happens when a drowning episode takes place, then we can translate that very quickly to, well, what was missing? And in several studies that have interviewed survivors of drowning episodes, they tell us what they couldn't do and what threatened their life and why they would not have survived if they had not been rescued. Here's an example. Both Steve and Kevin and others have talked about breath control as an important competency. Buoyancy control is an important competency. And so just as an example, let's have a look at these two and how they relate and why they relate and how the relationship has a special meaning for the evolution of a specific drowning episode. In spite of the fact that some people are still doubters, it's very obvious for us in this room that how and how much and when and where and why we breathe determines how we float or not float, to float or not float. That is the question. So I would suggest that we can look at parts, we can look at these elements as pieces of a puzzle, all of which are related, and I'd like to suggest that we can think of a kind of a glue that holds these parts together, which I'd like to call a certain kind of critical mass. And when we analyze a drowning episode, a drowning survivor might say, well, I couldn't breathe, or I failed to roll over onto my back to get a breath, or I couldn't move because I was fully clothed, or the water was too cold. But all of these things are related, and that drowning episode is a holistic occurrence where there's a relationship between all of these parts. And in my mind, and this is the part that's speculative, this is the part that I believe, but it's not been proven, there emerges a critical mass which is an entity on its own, aside from the two elements we might be talking about which are related. In that space, which we could call the relationship, a unique new entity arises. And I think we often forget that. So when certain elements are weaker, when the breath control is weak, a person simply hasn't mastered that. When the buoyancy control is weak, then the relationships don't develop. An important element in preventing that drowning episode has not developed. It's not there. Something else is missing. Something that we never talk about. Now, I have to back up a second. I'm going to end up with a recommendation about how to teach. But good teachers have always done this, so it's not new. But the good teachers are only 10% of all of the teachers of swimming, if we're lucky. And I've said something already about why I believe that. And the inexperienced teachers have probably never done what I will end up recommending, which obviously is why I'm recommending it. So if we have a look at this particular graphic, which I'm told isn't really representative of the idea I'm trying to convey, we immediately see that the two large white circles represent the example that I've chosen to use, the relationship between breath control and buoyancy control, and the black arrows between the two large white circles represent the relationships. And if you have, for example, weak or missing breath control when you're challenged with an emergency, and if you have weak or missing buoyancy control in the same situation, then the relationships are weak. And then this happens. And I borrowed this from Kevin. You'll remember the chap who's obviously in trouble. So while you're catching your breath and wondering what the hell this guy's talking about, I'd like to suggest that these relationships between the obvious things that we're concerned about are rarely discussed. So I'm going to suggest a strategy for teaching, a pedagogical strategy, which might help us with this challenge which I've described. And I want to give credit to Professor T.K. Curitin already in 1949, under whom I was fortunate to study in the old days, not as long ago as 1949, by the way. I'm not that old. When he said that, when he did a sophisticated statistical analysis of the elements in a teaching progression of swimming, and he said that any time we combine several elements, two or more elements within a teaching progression, we get a better prediction of the final outcome. And yet you all know swimming teachers who go through a progression and they start with step 1 and they go to step 2 and they go to step 3, and by the time they get to step 3 they have forgotten step 1. Are you with me? I hope this isn't something that's only in my own head. I hope I'm finding a way to say these things in a meaningful way. Then recently, in 2013, Oliveira and colleagues took a group of children through a program. They had all mastered all of the elements. And I don't know how she got through the committee to be allowed to do this piece of research, but she set up an unannounced capsize of an RIB so that the children were thrown out of the boat without knowing that this was going to happen. It was all filmed and analyzed, and they found that even though these children had mastered many competencies, over a third were judged by a panel as being seriously at risk. In other words, yeah, they could hold their breath. Sure, they could float, but they'd never been challenged to do both at the same time. That would be at least my interpretation. So my suggestion for a pedagogical strategy is in fact the mirror image of what I've tried to describe as a description of how a drowning episode evolves. If the drowning episode is a holistic occurrence, then the way we teach needs to be holistic as well. We need to focus on the parts as well as the relationship between the parts. We need to help those relationships develop. We need to increase that critical mass. We need to make the parts bigger. And here's the way to do it. But you all do this because you're in that 10%. So we have to go home and tell the 90% that this is important, at least if you agree. And I use the expression the cascade effect. A cascade, of course, immediately suggests a stepwise descent, perhaps a river running down a mountain. When the Nile empties into the Mediterranean, there's a much more huge volume of water than at the source of the Nile. New water is added all the way down. And this stepwise cascade I would compare to the steps in a teaching progression, any teaching progression. And we have step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. Everybody okay? But this happens over time. And time does something good for us. I forgot to say it, but it suddenly came to me again because I've written it someplace. What we're talking about really is similar to developing a good wine. To this date, as far as I know, every attempt to promote the development of a good wine in a chemical fashion to avoid time has failed. Norwegians say TTT, things take time. Well, maybe everybody says that. So what I'm suggesting here is that if we take time enough at each of these steps, a maturing process takes place, a consolidation takes place. So that when you get a kid to hold his breath 3 seconds, that's a great start, but 4 is better. And that's great, but 10 is better. And then when we get to step 2, if we combine step 1 and 2, allowing the relationships between step 1 and 2, which might be, for example, floating, allow the relationships to develop, we also get a cumulative effect. And that X is the relationship between the elements that we've combined. So you get a snowball as you roll down this hill. As the water flows down the river in a cascade with a kind of snowball effect. And of course the river and the snowball don't fit together very well, and I haven't figured out how to tackle that yet. But I'm totally frustrated when I observe teachers who reach step 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 in the progression, and the kids still are not better at step 1. So I'm suggesting, as T.K. Curitan did in 1949, the combinations are important. And when we get to floating, we have to combine that with breath holding. When we get to any step in the progression, what we are really looking at is not step 10, but step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 also. At lunch, I'll probably ask you if you think that makes sense. I'm suspecting I'm going to get cut off before we have time for questions. But I think the typical approach among many teachers is that, okay, hey, great. These kids held their breath for 10 seconds. Now we go on to floating. To hell with breathing. But when you reach step 2, it's got to be 1 plus 2. And when you reach step 3, it's got to be 1 plus 2 plus 3, and so on. For example, breath holding. By the time we reach floating, we should expect the breath holding to have improved. Are you with me? Now, without focusing on it, and especially when floating with the face in the water, breath holding is part of the package. So now we expect more. And we ask for more. And if you ask for more, you get more. And by the time we float with motion, gliding, we expect even more. And so on. And in this way, I'd like to suggest that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Something I thought once was a good idea, but right now, at this moment, I'm not so sure. Or let me put it another way. This is an idea in development, and I will appreciate your feedback, because this is something I can't prove, but by golly, I believe it. Thank you very much.